All right, welcome to the very first episode of my how-to gardening series, gardening in the Las Vegas area, low desert. Today's topic is going to actually be about shading your garden because, as you can see, it's November and it's bright out here right now. So this is the garden, and I've applied various types of shade to protect the plants, but some of it is also in the composition. So if you look here, this is the southern portion of the garden. I planted trees on this side, so there's a pomegranate, a fig, and another pomegranate, and then there's some shade trees in the corner in order to eventually create a permanent wall of shade on the south, at least in the summertime. All of these trees are deciduous, except for the one I'm about to show you, which I didn't plant. This one right here and grew on its own. So that one will not lose its leaves, but the rest of them will lose their leaves in the winter eventually. And so they won't block the sun fall time in the winter. But the point of that was so that they would grow up and then provide some shade. This particular shade cloth here was an idea that was given because it's used in playgrounds here to protect kids from the sun. I learned, however, that it has two huge problems when it comes to gardening. Number one, it blocks 100% of the sun. And so you see here in the center, there's nothing growing there because I wasn't able to get anything to actually grow there. It wouldn't get enough sun, and then it would actually die. The second thing was that this is in the design. I don't know if you can see this in the sun here, but we had a storm, and this tie is actually sewn in to the material here, and the wind was so strong it actually ripped it right out. So this is held together right now with copper wire because I don't care how strong the wind is, that won't work. So this particular shade is great for shade, but not so great for gardening. This here is a shower curtain that's sort of tacky and white trash, but it has the advantage of moving around when it's windy and not being firm. And the reason for that is in the late afternoon of summer, the sun comes up over there, comes through this hole, and bakes everything in the afternoon. So it gets sun protection from the building in the morning, from the boards, from the tree that's planted back there. Again, a tree planted for shade, and then it burned everything back in here. So what I had back in here were peppers and herbs. There's a grapevine back in there, and then the blackberry, which just got baked. So I had to come up with some other ways. My preferred way to shade the garden is to use other plants to shade the garden. So this pepper plant in here was actually planted inside this tomato plant and somehow survived. The tomato plant provided the shade necessary. I grew these beans here primarily to shade this area and protect it so that it would grow. This is, believe it or not, a single tomato plant. This is one, there's one up there, and then there's one here, and that's it. These are just 3 plants. And even this is the same plant. Nice big tomato on it too. I don't know if you can see that. But there's some other things with shade that have to do with the placement of things in the garden that you need to keep in mind. This right here is no longer in the sun, but I have some strawberries right here, which only a few hours ago in the earlier morning, this was in full sunlight, and I had to put these ghetto-y buckets here to block the sun because in the hottest part of the summer, the sun comes between the hole in the houses, burns right through here, burns all of this, burns everything back into this section. So I tried this summer to use burlap fabric, and it basically was worthless. I'm not exactly sure why. So next year I'm going to use these trellis materials, which I've staked in here. Then I'm going to use some metal trellis here to put a shade over this. And then I use a lot of plants. So the grapevine here was originally used to shade this blackberry bush. And the blackberry bush, it'll be 3 years old in March of next year. And you can see that it's doesn't seem to. I mean, it does get burned by the sun. There's some burn marks here. That's from sun exposure, and that's a problem. But the grapevine was able to shade it enough until it got established. So I also have these cat's claw, which I have grown here. I wanted them to grow on the wall, and they finally figured that out. But they're also growing on other plants and providing shade, which is also a benefit. I've got to figure out something to do here, because this lemon tree isn't providing the shade that I want it to. Plus, I also realized this summer the danger coming through this direction. Plants getting burned here through the hole in the houses. This is, let's see, this is one tomato plant. There's 2 tomato plants and 2 pepper plants in here. And then this section here got burnt to a crisp. And it's right now being reseeded. So right now I've got carrots, beets. There's some artichokes in there and such that are, winter vegetables that are growing in there. Winter does not mean the same thing in Nevada that it means everywhere else. So then the rest of this is what we have here in the center of the garden. I originally bought this 10 by 20 foot military camo tarp in order to create shade, and I bought that because it was the smallest size that provided what I wanted. Initially I wanted shade to go out and extend and cast a shadow this direction. And so I bought this because it fit the house, but I realized that this was not actually going to do what I wanted it to do. First of all, is the shoddy construction. So you can see that these are simply tied on here. And so in the wind, this thing basically ripped itself apart. It's ripped itself off the house several times, and I've had to put this other shade fabric on top of the structure to give myself any shade whatsoever. This lasted for about 2 years. It was $50 for a 10 by 20, $50 every 2 years, not so bad. The triangular one on this side, it's not as good, is $15. It lasted for 1 year before the wind ripped it. I imagine it will hold up for much, much longer, but I have something else I'm working on that is a little bit more weather resistant and a little bit more of the actual dimensions that I want. I figured I'd try this. I have another one that I haven't put up that I'll probably just use for personal shading to shade the center section for the purposes of shade, because like I said, this is not the type of material if you want to garden. I can see the shower curtain back there because it does move with the wind. Provides total blockage during part of the day, and then partial blockage during the day by virtue of the fact that it's actually mobile. This here was the standard camo netting, which was about 60% filtration of light. And well, it worked really well. This is an apricot tree that's really healthy, and some volunteer corn. So what I'm actually going to do here is something completely different in the future. Using this particular type of structure, I'm going to build a net over the plants in order to provide blockage. This one will be set back a little bit because I need it to cast a shadow this direction during the day, but on this side I am going to start it at the front here. It'll only be about this high. And only be about 4 or 5 feet off the ground, so that it casts a shadow over the garden and doesn't block everything else. Because I liked walking back here and being in the shade, but it's actually not that important since I do most of my gardening in the early morning and in the evening. So with that, we'll get into the actual theory of shade in the garden. Shading your garden is a function of controlling how much light gets to your plants, because it's not the water in Nevada so much that affects your plants, it's actually the light exposure. I'll elaborate. Because what actually happens is if you use water in order to protect your plants from the environment, then what you actually do is run the risk of doing one of two things. Number one, drowning the plant. Young plants do not have the biomass necessary to respond to large influxes in water, since the water will pool in your garden, and so you'll actually either drown them or you will cause other damage to the plant by pouring too much water on top of them. The second risk that you run is actually fungus exposure. Fungus exposure can be mitigated by burying pennies in your garden, but it's not water that's the problem, it's actually the sun. The sun will suck the water out if it's there. The sun will also cause so much damage to the plant that the plant will not actually be able to, it doesn't have enough biomass in order to lose the number of cells necessary in order to accommodate for the intrusion on the plant. So if you remember that from the blackberries, the necrosis along the edge of the leaves is because those cells are actually dead and dying, and they're being sacrificed in order to save the rest of the plant. And that's true of a lot of plants in a Nevada garden in the backyard. That unless you really have a nice biome and everything's hunky-dory and you've got a bunch of established plants, it doesn't really work. So in a vegetable garden where most of your plants are annuals, you can't really have a lot of established plants. So the blackberries would work, the grapes would work, but as for most of the vegetables, it's not going to meet your needs. So you need to keep the sun off. The smaller planters that were wood surrounded in the front that I'm going to be covering are actually only this deep with dirt. And then the other half of the depth is actually filled with rocks. The point of that is to get the soil to drain so I don't drown the roots, so I don't cause the roots to rot, etc., etc. Also because I want the roots to go down and not out, because that's how most people garden in Nevada, is without respect for regard for the soil. So shade, blocking the sun, that's key. And you can do that one of three ways. Number one, planting appropriately. If you have the right orientation, then planting a garden becomes easier. The two most preferable planting orientations in Nevada are to have an eastern face backyard like I do, or to have a northern face backyard. And the reason for that is because it provides the maximum amount of shade from the house on your garden during the time when the sun is the most damaging. Most plants in an arid environment stop photosynthesizing before noon. Therefore, the amount of the sun that exposes to the plants in the morning is the sun that they will use, and then the rest of the sun is blocked during the most arduous parts of the day when they're not using it anyway. So ranging your garden is key. So I have the shed out back, which provides a southern blockage. I planted the trees along the southern border to eventually, hopefully, provide some sort of shade. And then the house itself, since it's a two-story, provides some degree of shade. Basically, after about 3:30, 4:30 in the afternoon, the house, the backyard is mostly shaded, except for on this northern side where the light comes around the northern edge of the house. And so it drops the temperature from 110 to 100 or 105 to 95. It becomes sort of pleasant to work in the garden. And as soon as the house is in the shade, or the garden is in the shade, I go out there at 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock is also because that's when water becomes cheaper here. And that's when I water the garden, work in the garden, and take care of the garden, because I can still see it, it's still sunny, it's shady, and water is cheap. Okay, so number two, planting accordingly. So you want to plant your plants so that those that are the most sun tolerant are going to shade the ones that are the most sun susceptible. A lot of the plants in the nursery will say that they love full sun. That does not mean they love full sun in Nevada. Okay? But things that can tolerate it, or things that you're going to water enough in order for it not to make a big difference, things that are going to be perennials, like the fruit trees, what else out there is a perennial? The berry bushes. I have a few other perennials out there. The perennials that you can plant, and then you use the perennials to shade your annuals, and then they can grow as sort of a co-op. If you are planting annuals together, then you need to plant the annuals together so that they cooperate with each other, like the tomato plant and the pepper plant that were growing alongside each other. Because the plants will share the water, the biome, the roots, and then they will shade each other. And it sort of works. A lot of plants that I plant don't make it. And I know that. It's Nevada. I don't have a garden to feed myself. This is not subsistence agriculture. This is more of a, hey, look, I know what I'm talking about because I studied plant physiology in grad school. Okay, number three about planting is providing shade when you need to protect young plants or new plants. So there are a couple of things you can do. The thing to consider is how much you need to block. The secretary of work asked me about buying some shade fabric, and I recommended that she get something that blocked 75% or more of the sun. Now, not 100%, because the triangle that I have hanging out there blocks 100% of the sun, and then what they do is they get sun in the early morning that comes in underneath it from the east, and then they get sun in the late afternoon, which is the hot sun that comes in from the west just before the house blocks it. So it's not really all that desirable, because the sun they either get is, well, the sun they get is direct, and they don't get anything filtered during the day. That thing basically blocks everything underneath it. It's great for shades and playgrounds, not for your garden. You don't want it to be 100, but you do want it to be the great majority. Anything that has a physical barrier, something that the sun is not going to rot, cool, anything that is resistant to the wind or will work with the wind is also important. Like I showed you that corner, that shade fabric, it just ripped it right out, and so it doesn't really matter anymore how well it was built or what it was made of. The wind just tears stuff up, and I'll get to what I'm going to do with that in a second. So then I have the ghetto shower curtain because it works with the wind, because I needed to have some blockage in there to protect some newer plants that I put back there. And then I have the trellis that I've put on the northeast side, so that in the late afternoon there's some blockage there. I may have to figure out something additionally to do there, but you know, it is what it is. It's either that or pour copious amounts of water on it and kill it for another reason. So what I'm actually going to do this next year, instead of buying a camo tarp, instead of using the I think it's green shade fabric that's hanging above that I used to replace the camo tarp, which is used to, you know, do dog runs and fences and stuff. I decided what I was going to do was build something that was weather resistant and wind resistant. What I've lighted on, which I will show you as soon as I have, you know, it built. My dad's been making fun of me because I've been talking about it for almost the entire year now. Is I'm going to make an aluminum net. So I got some aluminum wire, which you can buy on Amazon or on the internet or any other website. I don't want to tout Amazon too much because they're like sort of a bad monopoly. They have some bad habits, but you buy a spool. You want it to be 18 or 20 gauge. That has to do with the thickness of the wire. That's for rigidity and solidarity. And then I'm going to weave it through the tabs of aluminum cans. That way, if they're not aluminum, they're tin. Tin and aluminum are metallurgically very similar. Therefore, they won't rust to each other. Therefore, it won't corrode. And I'm going to build a net out of that. So I calculated it that if I run enough of them, what I can generate is more than 50% light reduction, because there's a physical metal barrier that will still allow rain, will still move in the wind, but is heavy enough that it won't blow and tear, and push comes to shove, I can actually push it and shove it up against the wall and push it out of the way. And I'll be setting that to hang about 5 feet above the garden to protect the garden, because the shade is for the garden. And also it's sort of this eyesore out there that I like looking out my back window into the backyard, except I have this ugly camo tarp. Not to mention the camo tarp, I think, makes the cops nervous. What are you doing under that camo tarp? And so the air unit's been here. The cops, I guess they must have looked in the backyard. It's just vegetables. But and I'm not drawing an excessive amount of power, so I'm not growing any drugs. But it just, I don't want to draw the attention. So if I have that, maybe it will be a little bit less. Also, it's removable, and I expect it to last longer. Now, it's going to cost a lot more than this, but if it does last longer, then it may have been worth it. I was able to procure the materials in order to build 2 of these nets. So I have one on each side, not just one big one that stretches over, you know, yard where I'm not growing anything. And I think I did that they would cost me $40 a piece. So it's basically the same coverage, but I have one on the north, one on the south. The materials are $40. I have to build it myself. So it's actually relatively expensive, but if it lasts more than 2 years, then it will start to pay for itself in terms of labor. So basically what you need to do, number one, is make sure that you protect your plants from the sun. It's not the water. I mean, water is important. We'll get to that. But sun is the biggest thing. Make sure that you protect your plants from damage from the sun. We put sunscreen on, we put clothes, hats, sunglasses, and then we throw our plants in the backyard and wonder, why are they all burnt up? Because we just don't think outside the box. So thank you for joining us for episode number 1. I hope you come back and see episode number 2.